So good afternoon. I have a slight feeling of guilt as you all look like you're having so much fun talking to one another. And now we're going to interrupt your conversation with something a little bit more difficult. And in fact, you don't want to stop talking. So I'm Ann Applebaum from the Washington Post and other institutions. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we now have a panel which is going to discuss one of the most difficult, heavily politicized, complicated issues that exist in this country, in this part of the world, and I would say actually more generally in all of our countries, which is the issue of corruption. And we have here a somewhat one of the more interesting panels that you can find. We have, on the one hand, on the far left, Vitaly Krasko, who is the Deputy Prosecutor General of Ukraine as of 5 days, as of a week. It depends on how you count days versus working days. Who is very much on the ground and ready to go and has new programs. And we also have two very grand economists. Darren Akemoglu, who is the Institute Professor of Economics at MIT, the author of Why Nations Fail, more recently The Narrow Corridor, which is a book about, among other things, democracy and why we have to be so careful about it. On my left is Jeff Sachs, the university professor at Columbia, who's been involved in this region and in economic transformation in this part of the world and indeed all over the world for more than 30 years. I first met him in Warsaw in 1989, pretty much almost exactly 30 years ago when we were having some very similar conversations. Corruption, to discuss it at this point in Ukrainian history is also particularly difficult and poignant because we've just had an election in which corruption was one of the central issues, if not the central issue. Those of you who watched now President Zelensky's television program, Servant of the Nation, will know that over and over again, the main character, the teacher who becomes the accidental president, runs into corruption. It begins in the very first program. It continues as a theme throughout the series. And it was really that theme and originally his ranting about corruption that got him accidentally elected president and which has now not accidentally elected Zelensky himself, the real president of Ukraine. He won the election promising to do something very specific about corruption. He spoke very specifically about arresting people. He implied there would be really big changes. And that's where I'd like to begin this conversation with what is, first of all, I'd like to define a little bit what we mean by corruption, but also to look and pick apart some of the possible solutions. What this panel is not going to be, and we just decided this with all of its members, is it's not going to be people from the West telling Ukrainians what to do or offering them solutions, because we think that all the really good and important solutions are going to come from inside Ukraine. And besides, as US and other European politics now illustrates, we're perfectly capable of generating corruption all by ourselves. But Vitaly, since you're the new member of the panel, why don't I begin for a moment with you and get you to lay out for this room, some of you will know the answers to this, but some won't, what exactly you see your job as being right now and why it's about corruption. What is it that being what the Prosecutor General's office is going to do that's different from what's been done in the past?
Thank you. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. The topic of the conference and of the panel is about happiness, and in my view, prosecutors are not usually considered as persons who make people happy, because then the criminal justice system is functioning well, it goes without saying for the society. It is considered as a normal and stable thing to have a normal, fair criminal justice field. But on the other hand, the lack of effective law enforcement instruments, the lack of fair trial, and the corruption in the public service is usually considered by the nationals, by the citizens, as something that creates unhappiness. That is why I think that the main task of the prosecution service, as it is now, is first to fight corruption. First of all, so-called grant corruption, which was always the problem in Ukraine, including the corruption in law enforcement and judiciary. But at the same time, the prosecution service is going to do it in full accordance with the human rights and rule of law principles. So I hope you will never see the effects of gross violations of human rights or any attempts to put somebody in jail without evidence. The work of the prosecution service will be conducted in the full accordance with the highest standards to contribute to the rule of law in Ukraine.
So thank you. Jeff, we spoke a little bit before we began about different categories of corruption, whether this is something that we need to break down into categories before thinking about it. You've just heard one piece of the story. Is this the right place to start?
Thank you very much. One of the themes of our meeting is TV becoming reality. We've had The Servant of the Nation, and we had House of Cards with Robin Wright last night. I want to introduce a third television series just for a moment, the Danish political series called Borgen. Very, very interesting. Everybody should watch it. The worst crime committed in House of Cards, of course, is the president murders the reporter. In the Danish show, the worst crime that is committed is that the prime minister accidentally uses his official credit card for a private purchase, and he has to resign. And it was just because he didn't have 2 days to make the reversal to the right credit card. Now, I want us to reflect on this because it actually reflects something quite real. The United States is an incredibly corrupt country right now. We have the most corrupt president we've ever had in our history. He is a massive tax evader and a massive cheat. But we also have, in Denmark and in Sweden and in Norway, truly honest, functioning governments. That's amazing. Don't think it's impossible to have very low levels of corruption. Your neighbors are the most honest governments in the world. Go learn from them. Take a trip, not with your, maybe with your official mission, and learn how they do it. Now, I think that what's important is there are many different varieties of corruption. We should keep that in mind. There is, of course, the high larceny of the state, where there's big money and big politics. As Vitaly mentioned, there is corruption of court decisions, private decisions. There's corruption of the police. Can you call a policeman and have an honest judgment? There's corruption of the public administration in tax. There's corruption of procurement systems. So each of these requires a different kind of perspective. And it really is needing a professional, transparent perspective on this. The hardest for all of us in our country, in your country, is big money and big politics. The most annoying for the public, actually, is the day-to-day corruption of public administration and public services, and that is more controllable. but we're all in a battle against impunity. How do we have responsibility at the top? In the United States, we have an absolutely overtly corrupt president, but the system is unable to control that corruption. He just laughs it off. He calls it fake news. And so far, nothing happens. So this is a problem for all of us that is a quite deep problem.
That actually, your two first statements, are a good reminder that one of the, you can have in the institutions that theoretically exist to fight corruption without having them actually function, which has been a problem in Ukraine up until now. Darren, maybe I can move to you and ask you to think a little bit about, because you've written very eloquently and beautifully about the importance of functioning institutions in different kinds of countries. Is there something, in order for Vitaly to be a success, his institution will have to be somehow accepted as neutral, as having authority, as having, as having authenticity? Are there other countries you can point to? Are there other historical examples where people have transformed the prosecution service in that way?
Thank you, Anne. It's great to be here, and I think it's fantastic that the country is focusing so much on corruption, which has been a real problem for Ukraine as in many other countries. But I think a first observation that's relevant for thinking about these issues is that corruption is more often than not a symptom, not a cause. It is a symptom of an institutional structure that creates a lot of economic, political, and social problems. And thinking about corruption in isolation doesn't really help us understand these issues. Corruption doesn't come out of thin air in Ukraine either. I think the most important thing, which everybody in this room of course knows, is that Ukraine, like many other Soviet republics, had a transition away from communism that was shepherded by former Communist Party elites that reinvented themselves as independence leaders. And in pretty much every place where that happened, the economic structure created oligarchs, inequality of outcomes, inequality of opportunities remained, and a distorted political structure that did not have accountability and that did not really give voice to the people and therefore did not have the sorts of institutions that people could trust developed. And it is not surprising that that sort of political system is unable to keep the lead on corruption. But that also brings me to thinking about what's the most problematic aspect of corruption. Of course, economists have emphasized how it leads to low investment or misallocation of resources, and those are completely right. But the real problem about corruption is that it destroys trust in institutions and it destroys trust in markets. And previous episodes in which people have said, we're going to deal with corruption, have typically failed because they haven't really tackled these issues. Egypt has one of the most celebrated anti-corruption bodies that was set up by Colonel Nasser. It didn't do anything for Egypt, Mubarak and his cronies stealing more than $2 billion. In every African country, you've had an anti-corruption body, but they've all been sidelined when they have started trying to ask uncomfortable questions. And in all of these cases, these anti-corruption bodies and drives have actually made things worse because they've been perceived as imposed on society by elites as part of an elite deal. It's just like in China where you go after your rivals using corruption as an excuse. So how do you actually resolve this issue? What do the successful cases do? I don't think there's an easy solution, and I'm not going to fall into the trap that Anne warned us about. I'm not going to tell Ukraine how to do things. But the general principle is that you don't solve any problem, let alone something as complex as corruption, by just legislating it out. Just before I came here, I talked to 100 young leaders. And to put it bluntly, I think if you want to deal with corruption, the solution shouldn't come just from this room. It should come more from them. So you need society to be an equal partner, to buy into the reforms, to be the force that actually pushes through societal organizations, civil society, media, to propel the government and the judiciary ahead in order to deal within law and with clear rules, with clear evidentiary basis with the problem of corruption. So it's that meeting of norms and laws that is necessary, and every case that has been successful has done a version of that. Scandinavia, for example, that Jeff mentioned, is just a perfect example of that. Finland, which has actually a lot of similarities to Ukraine, it started with the Russian threat and in a very bad situation at the end of World War II. It managed that, but not by just legislating it, through a bottom-up process of state institutions and society working together. And I think that's a very important lesson to bear in mind. Of course, the details matter, and I hope I can come back to that without extending my comment now further.
You know, one of the specifics of Ukraine, and one of the things that makes Ukraine unusual in this region, is the strength and sophistication of its anti-corruption NGOs, its organizations, of Transparency International, which I know you know about. Have you thought at all about how you're going to work together with them? Is that something you can talk? Because that was one of the most important criticisms of the previous government, which is that it didn't find a way to work with those organizations to solve these problems.
Yes, that's true. Ukraine is well known for very strong investigative journalism and also very strong and advanced NGOs dealing in the area of anti-corruption. And as far as was, for me, I was the member of the board of Transparency International Ukraine, if you know, and of course they are going to cooperate very closely with NGOs and investigative journalists. Another very interesting aspect, if they are talking about Ukrainian realities, is that to combat impunity, in my view, we would need not only to put corrupt public officials in jail, because it was always the problem for Ukraine. Usually they are not imprisoned. They are punished by fines or conditional imprisonment. It's very important to ensure real justice in this field, but also to use another very important preventive instrument, allowing to deprive the corrupt official of the financial gain obtained as a result of corruption. Because as far as you know, there are public officials who are ready to sit in jail for several years in order to use afterwards the gains obtained as a result of corruption. And that is why the new government also prepared a draft law on so-called civil confiscation, which is not based on conviction, and it concerns only public officials. So if public official cannot explain reasonably the discrepancy between the lawful income and the assets acquired, it will be the matter for specific civil claim. And this civil claim will be also considered by the newly appointed judges of High Anti-Corruption Court. So you know that international community took part in the selection of these judges, and there is a high level of trust for these judges. I really hope that these two components, really serious sanctions for corruption and also deprivation of the profits obtained as a result of corruption, will give a strong effect and will allow to combat corruption and impunity in Ukraine.
But there are a couple of traps you could fall into, and I hope Jeff and Darren will also comment on them. One of them is the possibility that, I mean, and this has happened in many times before in many other countries, that the anti-corruption drive becomes political. In other words, and I'm just saying this in general terms, but that it becomes something that's used to arrest the enemies of whoever's in power. And this has happened in too many other countries to ignore it as a possibility. And the other issue specifically that you face here is the question of backwards justice. In other words, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when people were corruptly accumulating their wealth, it's not clear whether they were breaking the law or they were doing things that everybody was doing. In other words, how do you decide who to target? And you know, if you can answer that to the extent that you can possible, and then maybe the two of you could reflect on these two issues, how they've been solved in other countries.
As for the link with politics, it's true in Ukraine. That is why, in my view, it's very important not only to have very strong and efficient law enforcement agencies and judiciaries, but also to ensure the high level of independence for both law enforcement, prosecution, and judiciary. They do not need convictions taking into account political affiliations. They need fair trial. They need fair justice.
The idea is that the prosecutor's office will be totally separate from the government.
Absolutely. It's a part of judiciary according to the Constitution, and I really hope that the highest level of independence will be ensured, because in any other case, it would be really hard to ensure justice, real justice for all in Ukraine.
Well, and then we'll return to the question of backwards justice in a section.
I think that's a very important point you've made, and also a general issue for Ukraine. You're a very young democracy. You have the chance, actually, to make institutions that can work. And so you're still in the mode of institution building. In the United States, we have a constitution that is 230 years old now and very hard to change. When the U.S. Constitution was made, the only model that they had for a leader was the king. They didn't want a king, so they made a president. That was the only alternative. It turns out 230 years later that the president is like a king, far too much. And countries in general with strong presidents have all of the problems of kings. They have the impunity, they have the corruption, and so on. Countries with strong parliaments, like the Scandinavian countries that we talked about, are much better at controlling these problems because they don't have that strong executive. Mubarak was, because of being that one executive, able to have so much power. So one thing that I would recommend in general to any new democracy that has still the chance to move is don't go for a strong presidential model. The parliamentary model is much better at dispersing power. It's much more protection for democracy. And of course, you're coming out of a system that started with the czar and then a Communist Party leader, and so president is a natural transition in a way. But I think the lessons of history are that more dispersal of power is better, and the parliamentary systems with strong parliaments and very nice constitutional monarchs are the best. So yes. I would argue that this is one of the problems of the impunity. If you have too strong an executive, almost anywhere it's going to be very, very hard to keep the rule of law. We know that in the United States, even with all of the constitutional checks and balances, we can't control the executive.
Yes, there is the counterexample of a very famous parliamentary democracy on the other side of Europe, which is melting down right now, but we're going to leave that aside for the moment. Did you want to add to this?
But not out of corruption, just out of incoherence.
Anyway, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I actually agree a little bit with Jeff that presidential systems that concentrate too much power in the hands of a single person without checks and balances are terrible. Turkey just changed its constitution in that direction with disastrous consequences. But there are plenty of parliamentary democracies that are very corrupt too. And I think the problem is that, and this is the really most important theme of the new book that I have with Jim Robinson, The Narrow Corridor, is that just constitutions, checks and balances, what you write on paper, are not enough. To make anything work, but especially when it comes to making laws work, controlling corruption, to make regulation work, you need a delicate balance between society's organizations and participation and the laws and state institutions and the ability of the elites and experts to dictate policy and priorities. Without that balance being struck, it's very difficult for anything to either get done or when it gets done to have any sort of legitimacy. So when you have just constitutions or elite designs, whatever they are based on, there's the model which is imposed on the society for controlling any problem, including corruption, that's not going to be as effective. And when you look at the cases where success has been seen in controlling corruption or undertaking reform, more often than not, even when the rhetoric is about brilliant policies of some experts, it's really that societal mobilization that's very important. So, for instance, for Ukraine as well as Finland, another model is Poland. Of course, Poland is currently going through very troubled times, and that is not to be ignored, and I think there are some important lessons there too. But even more important is to think about what Poland achieved at the end of the Soviet era. Well, the standard narrative is, Western experts told Poland to do shock therapy and improve their markets.
I don't know which Western experts you're talking about.
Well,
yeah.
I don't know either. Many. But the reality is more complex, because unless you can take into account that in the form of solidarity and other organizations, society got involved, strikes skyrocketed, protests were made, people got involved in politics, the situation would have been very different. Without the trade unions being brought on board, society sort of buying into the reform process, things would not have worked out. So in some sense, looking back, from my particular vantage point, I see the success of the Polish transition not as one of shock therapy or imposed reforms, but society being involved. That's what failed to happen in Ukraine. That's what failed to happen in Russia. Those were much more of elite imposed affairs. But there, and I think this comes back to the point that Anne made, there's a great silver lining here. Ukraine has an amazing opportunity today, and that amazing opportunity has two sources. One is that this is a country that has a political tradition going back to the military democracy of the Cossacks or the Austria-Hungarian times of participatory democracy, and just a general tendency for people to protest. Protests were there in the 1990s, they were there during the first color revolution, they were there recently in the second color revolution. So that is the energy that needs to be cultivated. But that energy is not sufficient unless you institutionalize it. And its institutionalization is critical for the prosecutor general, it's critical for the president, it's critical for parliament. But that institutionalization generally fails. Most protests turn into some sort of revolution, and they go away without having a durable impact. What's critical, and what might be present today here in Ukraine, is that there's a shared understanding that there needs to be a broader change in institutions, not just in corruption, not just in locking people up, but the broader institutions, creating a less oligarchic system, more equality of opportunity, much more accountability, working through civil society organizations. But for that, you also need to change the economic system. You cannot change corruption by legislating it away. You cannot change corruption by telling people it's bad to be corrupt. But you cannot change corruption by taking opportunities away. You need to do all three at the same time. You need to take the opportunities away, which are plenty in Russia, plenty in Ukraine, which tempts business people to go into corruption. But at the same time, you need to start changing norms. And changing norms is actually not separate from what the prosecutor general does, because the prosecutor general has to be a leader in setting the standard of how institutions influence norms while also listening to the norms.
I will let you respond, but can we return before we change the subject to this question of backwards justice? Because while we're talking about the transition, how do you look back and given that one of the objectives of reform is also to deal with these deep problems of inequality, how are you going to go back 10 or 15 years, or have you thought about it yet, to corrupt actions that were taken in the past when there was a different set of laws and a different set of norms prevailing? Is that something you've thought about yet?
You know that in the countries the rule of law exists, there are always things like statute of limitations and other limitations by constitution and criminal legislation, limiting the powers of law enforcement to investigate what was committed in the past. If they are talking about ordinary corrupt crimes. But if they are talking about so-called grand corruption or corruption entailing serious consequences for their society, In our opinion, no statute of limitations should exist in this respect because this is a kind of social problem. It's more than an ordinary crime. That is why I think that taking this into account, the prosecution service will do its best to investigate the cases of grand corruption committed in the past.
I mean, given the numbers of people and the ways in which the law was broken in the past, is that something you'll be able to do? Do you have the resources?
This is about most serious cases of grand corruption. I'm not talking about ordinary corruption, because again, they are talking about the country where the rule of law exists. They cannot go beyond the limitations. And if they are talking about serious crimes, like, crimes against humanity, grand corruption, entailing consequences like that, I think that these cases should be investigated easily.
Jeff, do you want to add to that conversation? You're somebody who watched the transition from communism take place in a lot of different places. I know that you had both positive and negative views about it at the time, and I remember you talking about them. Is this the moment for a backwards look, or do you see some dangers in that?
Well, I think in general, societies have to spend most of their time looking forward. It's hard enough to stay alive and hard enough to manage in the present and the future. So if a country becomes too enmeshed in the past, it never escapes the past. I think that, therefore, the bulk of any energy should be looking forward. Of course, there's no hard and fast rule, but we have a Nobel Peace Prize laureate here, President Santos, who made peace in Colombia, and one of the issues that he faced and that Colombia still faces is how much do you look back at crimes that were committed by, say, the insurgents or the guerrilla movement in the past versus moving forward. In my opinion, it was always mainly look forward. Don't spend so much time. It became a major issue, transitional justice, what to do. But my balance in general is look forward, because if you fight all the past battles, you never get over the past. If you move forward, you can actually build the future, and this is what most people want also. Some are stuck in the past. There's the famous saying, if you forget the past, you're condemned to repeat it. My wife has an expression, if you don't forget the past, you're condemned to repeat it. And I think that that's also true. If you dwell too much on the past, you will live in the past. And don't go that way too much, because there's no time for it. The present is so complicated. Pay attention to building something in the future mainly.
Doesn't this get, though, to something I think we're alluding to, which is, is the problem that when Ukrainians talk about corruption, as you said at the beginning, they mean many different things. They mean paying bribes, but they also are referring to something that isn't exactly just corruption. It's this sense of unfairness and inequality that was somehow created by corrupt processes in the past. And, how then do you deal with that? And I'm interested in what anybody on the panel has to say.
Yeah, I broadly agree with what Jeff said. You have to look into the future. That's critical. But laws and justice also have a symbolic value. I think they send a signal to society about what that society's values are. And in that sense, not excessively, but a limited amount of looking at the past and see what are the biggest problems that we have faced and take action on them has great value in mobilizing society and getting society on board. So I actually think, exactly like Jeff does, that we have a lot to learn from the successful peace transitions like in Colombia or in South Africa. But the way that I interpret their success is a little bit different. It's not that they forgot to look at they chose not to look at the past, but they looked at the past as a way of building the trust for the future. So for instance, in the South African case, the principle was the crimes have to come out and the most serious ones have to be prosecuted. But if you were committing non-human rights abuses, that were, not in the category 1, as long as you came out in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, then you were going to be part of the amnesty. So I think that struck a balance between understanding the past, admitting the mistakes, moving forward, but still, not whitewashing everything. And I think something like that is necessary given the seriousness of the situation that actually brought 30 years of stagnation and failure to Ukraine.
That's true. I agree, and would also like to remind that the changes of people in power during previous periods, they are mainly pushed by the people who they are disappointed by the fact that grand corruption of the previous authority was not in fact investigated and prosecuted. And this is very important to understand what was the real reason for these changes. That is why, of course, they are not going to investigate everything in the past. This is not our main goal. Our main goal is to build a new type prosecution service and a new type of judiciary. But they should not forget about cases of grand corruption, and they should demonstrate the society that the cases of grand corruption and the public funds they abuse, the people they just cheat in the society, they should not go unpunished. This is our idea.
So that you address some sense of unfairness, that somehow there was an element of unfairness in the last several decades. Sorry, Jeff, you wanted to say something along those lines.
I did want to say that in the theme of happiness, it is absolutely clear that when people live in in societies where government corruption is perceived to be very high, the happiness is lower. It's a very strong inverse relationship. That means that there is an important benefit. It's the kind that Daron mentioned of general trust, of confidence in the society, of building this sense of honesty. Also, there is additionally a sense of a benefit of happiness of living in more equal societies in general, where the gaps are not so vast. And that involves a lot more than this issue that we're talking about. That involves building institutions of social services and education and quality infrastructure and inclusion. So that is a more general proposition. And again, I think that the reasons why your neighbors in Northwest Europe rank the highest in the world on both happiness, equality, and lowest corruption are all consistent with this. This is a general set of patterns that is within reach of Ukraine and very important to build. But I do want to add one more thought that we haven't discussed at all yet, and that is a huge amount of the corruption is international. It's not national.
I was just, my next question was going to be about the transnational.
Go for it.
The transnational component. It's very easy for the IMF or for Western governments to, and this is, I think, very often an excuse to distance themselves from Ukraine or not help Ukraine, is to say, Ukraine is so corrupt, fix that problem and then come and talk to us later. Failing, meanwhile, to acknowledge the transnational component of corruption. In other words, the ways in which Western banks, accountants, the real estate industry have helped and assisted the removal of money from this country, the laundering of it elsewhere. Is that going to be within your remit? Is that something you want to talk about? And maybe the two of you could also reflect on whether there are ways in which Ukraine could work together with other governments to fight this international corruption.
Of course, it's a very important problem to, first of all, to recover assets which are in fact now located abroad by corrupt officials. And of course, there are countries which, whom they have really good cooperation in this respect, who are cooperating well, who are investigating corruption crimes abroad, including money laundering, and they are also going to have, or they're going to apply new instruments of international cooperation, like joint investigative teams with the countries who are willing to cooperate in this respect. You are, no doubt, you know that the process of asset recovery, if they are talking about transnational corruption, is not an easy and not an fast as they would like to have. But they need to initiate this process, they need to create strong relations with other international partners, and they need to find the ways how to recover these assets from different jurisdictions. They already have a lot of arrangements with other international partners. They have new criminal proceedings and new ways of cooperation, and still expecting for better cooperation from problematic jurisdiction in this respect. I'm not going to mention now these countries, but you are no doubt know about countries like that. So there is still serious hope that in the near future we will recover most of the corrupt assets located abroad, taking into account the provisions of the UNCAC, you know, United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which obliges the participants of this convention to repatriate, not to share the assets obtained as a result of corruption, but to repatriate the assets to the country, the corrupt assets they in fact stolen. So this is our priority. They already talked about that, not only to bring somebody to criminal responsibility, I mean, when they are talking about public officials, but to recover the damages caused by grand corruption.
I mean, absolutely, asset recovery is very important, but isn't there also another level at which all of us should begin thinking about this, namely, you know, joint international efforts to think about ending the systems themselves? Have you given some thought to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and Jeff is absolutely right. You know, the blame is international. This feeds into the point that I made. You cannot uproot corruption unless you deal with all three problems: laws, norms, and opportunities. But opportunities in, for example, China or Russia are completely intermingled with international investment in those countries, and most of the companies and the countries that do business are completely complacent or even complicit. In the Ukraine, the situation has not been very different. How do you deal with that problem? I mean, recognizing that problem is important, but how do you deal with it? Well, I think there are two broad categories, and both of them are not easy, but require serious thought. One is that, you know, with many problems that are supranational, we need supranational institutions. You know, when most economic activity and legal problems were in a domestic, national institutions were good at that, but you know, as many of these problems have now an international dimension, we need supranational institutions. Today is a particularly bad day for thinking about this because international cooperation is very, very low.
Less than it ever was, yes.
And if we could get the international cooperation, I would say priority is to deal with climate change before Ukraine, but we should put Ukraine up in the priority list too. But there is a second solution, which starts domestically. Institutional and legal reform is not just a signal to the rest of society that they need to get their act together. They need to change their norms. They need to reconsider what's acceptable behavior among politicians, business elites, and their friends. But it's also a signal to the international community. You do not see the same sort of corrupt activity going to Sweden or Finland. You do not even see it for other European countries and some Asian countries. You see it in the countries which really signal to the international community that doing corrupt business is okay. So international community is complicit, complacent, but it has to start domestically given the current conjecture.
Jeff, did you want to add to that?
Just wanted to add that there are 5 countries that are probably most responsible for the international complicity. Switzerland, Netherlands, Luxembourg, the UK, and the United States. They run the international banking system. Every transaction is recorded. Everything is known. But it's completely complicit. So it's not that this is secrecy unknown. This is just the system. The system is designed to hide wealth, and we shouldn't have a system like that internationally because it makes it very hard for any national government to function. And it is the supposed rule of law countries that are the highest on the list, and that's not coincidental. They're the rule of law in that they protect the wealth. So you feel you can put the wealth in those countries and be completely protected. But think of Switzerland, what an interesting country. Complete rule of law, Calvinist country that is the home for anything goes because that's a safe place. Same with Luxembourg. Their foreign direct investment is $4 trillion in that little place. $4 trillion. Of course, that's nothing but impunity. It's a game. The IMF published a paper this week showing that 40% of the booked foreign direct investment is phantom investment. It's just shell companies. So we know this. But that's the system for the last 100 years. And it should stop because governments need revenues to provide health and education and infrastructure and the things that people need. And this system is designed not to have that happen. And we should know better at this point. You know, again, I argue, look forward, make the rules work, but it wouldn't take much because everything is known and nothing is done.
So we just have a few minutes left, and I thought we would finish by, let me just put one final question to the panel. And the question is, what does success look like? In other words, you know, I feel like I've been coming to Ukraine for 30 years, and this conversation about fighting corruption has also been going on for 30 years. Is there something that could happen? Is there a change that you would be able to point to? And when that happens, you'll say, right, we've achieved something. It's less. It's working. Vitaly.
I'll be short. In our sphere, the success is that the trust or the confidence of the society in what law enforcement is doing. So in fact, this is the justice, fair justice for all.
So when people trust their government to deliver justice.
Absolutely.
Do you want to make a stab at saying what success would look like? When are we done with this conversation?
I want to say, when I'm invited back 30 years from now, Victor, I say when I'm invited back 30 years from now, I want to say that this was the turning point for Ukraine, because this is really a very powerful moment for this country. There's a real opportunity, a new government, a new opportunity. There's peace right now, relatively, and I think there can be real peace in this region, which is absolutely vital. But I want to just make a prediction. We know what success would look like, but I want to make a prediction that this is a turning point, because I really deeply believe that it is a turning point. And with a new European Union Commission, a new government here, a new opportunity to think through the geopolitics of this region, I think that this is a great moment. So I'm just putting myself on the record that this is not another cycle. This is a real change of direction.
Would you like to have the last word? What would be the sign of success? When does this conversation end?
So first of all, I completely agree with Jeff. This is a critical moment, and there are reasons to be cautiously and very cautiously optimistic. But I think the challenges are also formidable. The challenges are nothing short of repeating a version of what several countries have been successful in doing, but many, many more countries have failed in doing, which is to take the energy and the desires and the aspirations of the people and channel them into an institutionalized form of keeping elites, governments, the judiciary accountable. And how to do that is very, very difficult, but there are several role models we can build on. And I want to just mention one of them briefly, which is the birthplace of democracy, ancient Athens. You know, it's an extreme example of how institutions developed in order to take that energy and translate it into an effective method of control. And one of them I would actually recommend to many modern countries, and it's the practice of ostracism. Every year, free Athenian citizens got together, and if the legislator voted to have an ostracism, they would write the name of a famous person on a piece of shard, ostrakon, and that's where the name ostracism comes from. And the name, whoever name was written most would get ostracized from the country. Now, very importantly, he wouldn't get executed. His assets would not be taken away, but he would be ostracized for 10 years. What does that mean? He would be cut to size. You know, society was saying, you're getting too big for your britches. We need to bring you back down to size. And I think that's what we need in many countries, and I think that's what exactly Ukraine needs through its institutional system, but with the cooperation of society.
Okay, well, with that, you know, more ostracism, more honesty, and a better prosecution service, and we won't have to have this conversation again. Thank you very much to the panel, and thank you all for listening.